Hello again. In this lesson we're going to be discussing how to handle events and set properties in code on the server. And we're going to talk again about the concept of PostBack and programmatically determine whether or not the current web request was a result of a PostBack or a first-time request. And we're going to talk about why that even matters. And then finally we're going to talk about the events that are at a more global level in nature at the session and application level. So if none of this makes sense, then you're in the right place. I'll try to explain all of this pretty thoroughly. Okay, so as we get started, let's review some of the things that we said earlier about how events are handled in your application. All of the Visual Basic code that you write gets compiled into a .NET assembly. The individual .aspx pages contain a page directive at the very top, which points to a specific class in the .NET assembly that's created. So when a page request is made, the ASP.NET Engine sends along information about whether this is the first time request for this page or whether it's the result of a postback, as well as which event actually caused the postback, like a button click, for example. It delivers the web request to the events handler, which is where you write the logic for your site. So in the first lesson, we talked briefly about how the page is then constructed and then passed back to the web browser that originally requested it. So there's three things that can affect the output. The first thing is the HTML that's contained in the .aspx page. Secondly, the server control tags in the .aspx page. And then thirdly, any modifications that are made to the server controls as events are handled within the .NET assembly for the website. So if you're still with me, you can forget what I just said. Take comfort in the fact that it just works. But know that the ASP.NET Engine handles the heavy lifting, which allows you to focus on the business functionality and the logic of your applications. So why did I bring all this up about PostBack in the first place? Well, there's two reasons. First of all, PostBack is very cool because it helps create the illusion that the user is working on a robust, full-featured application as opposed to working with just another website. In other words, it enables a more interactive experience that is responsive, not just to button-click events similar to submitting a form, but also to respond on the server to small events on the web page, like the selection of an item from a drop-down list box like we saw in the previous lesson, or clicking on a checkbox. At that point, we can interact with the user and change what the user sees on the screen, give him information, or give him a different web page. So if we were to try to do that without ASP.NET, it would require a lot of custom JavaScript coding, but fortunately, ASP.NET does all this for you, and we don't even have to write any code to make it happen. We just have to set a few properties. Okay, so let's start with the easy part. We've already done this in the previous two lessons, but we just accepted it at face value, and that is the setting of properties of our ASP.NET server controls in code. So we can do something like this. Let's double-click the button and get to the button 1 click event handler. And then do something like this. Textbox2.text equals textbox1.text. So whatever has been typed into textbox1 will then be placed into textbox2. Something very simple and straightforward. Now, as I pointed out in the first video, notice the IntelliSense that shows us the properties whenever I use the dot notation. Pops open all of the most common properties that can be adjusted within our applications. But then on the second tab, the All tab, notice that not only do I see more properties, but I also see all of the methods that are available, such as the toString method, and let's see, some other things that might be important to us. To check to see if it has any subcontrols under it, to determine and set whether it has focus or not, and so on. Okay, so in most cases we're just going to work with the common properties that are available here, which is an abbreviated list of the most popular ones that are available. So realistically, while there's just a few properties of a text box, or any control for that matter, that I might ever want to change, the fact is that I can set or get every property of a given control within my event handler. So there's a lot of power available to us programmatically as we create our applications. Now in this case, we're just going to remove this, And let's just quickly run our application to prove at this point that it works. Ask me if I want to debug. Okay, it's going to add a web.config. We're going to talk about that in another lesson here pretty soon. Okay, so if I type in the word Bob and click the button, I get Bob in text box 2. All right, so it works perfectly. So let's go on and talk about the next step in this process. And just like there's a form load event available whenever you're creating Windows Forms applications in Visual Basic 2005 or any previous version of Visual Basic, we also have a page load event in ASP.NET that fires each time a page is requested from a web browser. So I'm just going to double click anywhere in the white area here and notice that it gives me a page_load event handler. So we might use this for initialization purposes in order to set the default values and so forth. Now the trick is that this event fires every single time the page is loaded, even if the page is posted back once, twice, 3 times or more. So this is where it gets tricky. Let's add this code with the intent of initializing the text box to some default value. So we'll just do this. If textbox1.text equals empty string. So this looks innocuous enough, right? I mean, all we're trying to do here is set our textbox1 when the page loads to an empty string to default the value out, which we may do in other applications, and not really think a whole lot about it. All seems to work great right now. And I'm going to fill in the word Bob and click the button again. But now what happens? All I did was just set textbox1 equal to nothing. So what happened here? What broke? Well, actually nothing broke. It worked exactly the way that we told it to work. It's really a matter of the order in which these events are firing. Page load is firing before the button one click event. So in the very first, in the page load here, what we're doing is setting the text property of the textbox1 equal to empty string, and then the next event that fires is the button one click event where it sets textbox2.text equal to textbox1, which is now currently an empty string. So how can we overcome this problem? Well, the good news is that we can check for this condition by checking whether or not the page is being loaded for the first time or whether it's being loaded as a result of a postback. And the way that we do this is through a property of a special object called the page object, which is the isPostback property. Now, the page object contains a bunch of useful properties and methods and other objects pertaining to the current request and the current response for the current page. So I'm going to add in a little bit of code here. So if page.isPostback equals false, then okay, so what are we doing here? We're checking to see if this page is being posted back. Then and only then, if it's not being posted back, will we execute this line of code. If we are in a postback situation, then we will ignore this line of code. Okay, so the first time our form is loaded, the line of code that fires, that sets this to an empty string, works correctly. The second time, whenever we click this button, now isPostback equals true, it'll ignore that line of code, and now our application functions correctly once again. Okay, I hope that made sense, but we're going to move on. Before we close this lesson, let's talk about the lifetime of our web applications. Now, the first time a request from a web browser is made for any page within our website project, the object called application is created and maintained by the ASP.NET Runtime Engine. So this application object is kind of special. It contains information that's global to the entire website. Regardless of how many people access it or how many pages are contained within it, it's kind of the know-all, be-all object that contains information about our instance of our application running on a given web server. So when the application has been inactive for a long period of time, or when the website has been stopped at the web server level, the application object is removed from the computer's memory. Now similarly, there's another type of object that's created every time a user accesses a website, and it's called the session object. So a session can span multiple requests, but only for a single website user. So if you have 10 people accessing your website at the same time, there will be 10 session objects in the computer's memory, one for each user, regardless of how many pages each user has looked at, whether 1 or 100 pages. So after a long period of inactivity, like let's say 20 minutes or so, the session object is destroyed from the web server's computer memory. And the reason why it destroys is that it can't simply keep around all of these objects for every user, or else it would use up all the memory within the computer. So we're going to revisit the application and session objects several times throughout this series of lessons. However, since we're talking about events right now, let's talk about how to handle the 4 events that are triggered when the application starts and when it ends, and when a new session starts and when it ends. So in order to handle these 4 events that we just talked about, we're going to need to add a special file to our web project called the global.asax. And the way that we're going to add that is to select the Add New Item button on our main toolbar, on our standard toolbar. And then we're going to select the global application class. Notice that it by default names it global.asax, so we're not going to change it. We're going to click the Add button. Okay? So now it has 5 handlers in place. It has a handler for the application start and the application end. It also has a handler for whenever a session starts and whenever a session ends. So we can write code. Every time our application starts, we can initialize and cache, and we'll talk about caching a little bit later, where we can store up some of the common values that we might use throughout our application, or we can store information about individual users on our website, or every time, for example, a new user comes on our website, we can keep track of how many users are currently on the website. And let me show you how that's done. Let's do this. Let's write some code here. Now the application object has a neat little feature too that allows us to add kind of variables at this global level. So we're going to call this user count. We're just going to add a new variable, and that's how we do it. It's a variable that's maintained by the application object. We don't have to give it a type. It's of type object, which means it's a generic object. Okay, so we'll have to cast it whenever we're ready to work with it. But we're going to set whenever the application starts, we're going to initialize this user count variable called user count, and we're going to set it to 0. Then each and every time that a new session starts, we'll do this. Application user count, and then we'll use the plus equal 1 to increment the user count by 1. And then we'll do something similar whenever a session ends. So here we go, user count minus equal 1. So we'll decrement that user count application variable. Okay. Next thing that we want to do is actually show on screen what the current user count is. So let's go to our default.aspx.vb file. And from here we're going to, let's do this. Let's just put it outside of this. We're going to use our page object again. Remember we said that the page object controls information about the current user's current request and the current response from our website back to the user for the current page and the current user. Okay, so here we go. So the page has a request object. A response object. So we're able to write out to our response stream that information that's going to be sent back to the user. So page.response.write user count, and then we'll do this, application user count dot toString. Okay. So notice that we have access to this application variable from anywhere within our application. That's because it is at a very global level. We don't have to preface it by any other, variables or objects. We can reference this at any point in time. So let's go ahead and run our application now. And notice that the user count is set to 1. Let's do this. Let's copy this URL, open up a second web browser to simulate a second user, and I'm going to paste that web address, and notice that the user count hits 2. So if I were to refresh this first browser, notice that the user count goes to 2. Okay, no matter how many times I refresh each individual browser, the user count is still 2. Let's open up a third browser and we'll get the similar results here. Now the user count is 3. Okay, now if we were to wait around here for 20 minutes, it would decrement this count as well as each session object dies and is removed from the computer's memory. Okay, but in this lesson we talked about how PostBack works and how the ASP.NET Runtime Engine knows to pass along a notification to the event handler that should execute based on the postback of a control that's fired by the end user's web browser. We talked about a special event called the page_load event, and we discussed how to programmatically check to see whether the page request was due to an original request or a postback. And finally, we talked about the concepts of application and session and how to write code for the major events in the life of an application and session. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one, aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic, ASP.NET, and more. Thank you.